Hello everybody, and welcome to a level up video on combat tricks, and specifically how to play around combat tricks in the best way to maximize your win percentage when your opponent has a combat trick. So this is a pretty important topic because combat tricks are one of the fundamental building blocks of Limited, and many games will be decided by you getting blown out by a combat trick or you blowing out your opponent with a combat trick. So it's important to know how to not get blown out, and playing around combat tricks is one of the best ways to level up your gameplay. So how do you best play around a combat trick, and why should you do so? So essentially, when a combat trick is working efficiently, it is a cheap interactive spell that can allow you to trade up on mana. So for example, if I play a 3-mana 3/3 creature, and my opponent plays a 3-mana 3/3 creature, and I have a 1-mana combat trick that gives my creature +2/+2, if I then attack and my opponent blocks, I can essentially use my combat trick as a 1-mana kill spell because my opponent's creature will die and my creature will live, and so I spent 1 mana to kill my opponent's 3-mana creature. So that's one of the ways your combat trick can be used for value. Another way is if my opponent has a removal spell, say they have a 4-mana deal 4 damage, and I have my 1-mana +2/+2, they spend their 4 mana to deal 4 damage to my 3/3, I give my creature +2/+2, my creature lives, their removal spell essentially traded 1 for 1 with my combat trick, but they spent 4 mana, I spent 1 mana, I end up a little bit ahead on that exchange. So that's when combat tricks are working perfectly, but you can play around combat tricks in many scenarios. So I'm going to go through 3 primary ways to play around combat tricks, and these are all used in slightly different situations, but you can often identify when you should use each one. So first of all, one way you can play around a combat trick is simply by not blocking. And I'm primarily going to be talking about combat ways to play around combat tricks because it's a little bit more fringe for the combat trick to be used as a way to save the creature from removal. But that is something to keep in mind, but I'm going to primarily focus on ways to play around combat tricks in combat. So the first way is just by not blocking. So if they attack their 3/3 into my 3/3 and they have 4 open mana, I have no idea what they have. I have no mana up. And if I decide that I don't want to trade my 3/3 for their combat trick, I can just say, okay, I'll take the damage. And times when you might want to do this are, first of all, if your opponent doesn't have another blocker, you can sometimes just race them and say, okay, I'll take 3 from you, then I'll attack you back for 3. And that way you don't have to interact with their combat trick because you're never blocking. So that's one thing you can do if they don't have a follow-up creature, of course. But you can just say, well, maybe they don't have a follow-up creature, and I could get in for this damage here. Another reason you wouldn't want to do this is if your 3/3 creature was better than theirs. So if yours has a 5-mana activated ability and theirs doesn't, you might think, okay, I'm about to get to 5 mana. Next turn I'm going to have 2 turns from now, I'm going to have 5 mana. I think my creature is going to be more valuable than theirs in the long run, so I'm not going to block. And another reason you might not block is because you have a combat trick in your hand that you can use to counter their combat trick, or you have an instant speed removal spell, and you want to try and blow them out, or you might just have another blocker. So for example, one of the cases where you might want to do this is if I'm on the play, and on turn 4, I play a 4-mana 4/4 flyer, which is a pretty solid rare. Usually that's going to be at rare and limited. And my opponent has a 3/3 that they played last turn, and they attack me for 3. And they have their 3/3, they have all their mana untapped, and I have my 4/4, and my 4/4 is much more valuable because it has flying. So I think to myself, okay, I am not going to block their creature because their creature, if he has a combat trick, he's going to spend like 2 mana to kill my 4/4 flyer. And my 4/4 flyer is going to be great over the course of this game. They're not going to be able to block it and all that fun stuff. However, when I make that decision, I have to accept the fact that, first of all, I'm reading them having a combat trick and not just bluffing, because that's a pretty decent spot to bluff sometimes. Like if you don't think your opponent's going to block, or if they've been playing defensively in previous games of that match, you might think, okay, they're not going to block, so I might as well attack here. They're not going to block with their 4/4. Another thing you have to consider is, how am I going to deal with that 3/3 in the long run? So if I have a hand that's got no more creatures that can block it, like I have a couple 2/2s in my hand or something, and I have no removal for the 3/3, or I don't want to use removal on the 3/3 creature, I have to think, how am I going to deal with that 3/3 creature in the long run? Because it's going to keep attacking me every turn. They're going to have the combat trick for the rest of the game, presumably until I make them use it. So you have to have a plan. So if I have like a creature in my hand, like a 3/4, I can think, okay, I'll just block with that next turn, and then they'll use their combat trick to kill that. Or I could think, okay, I'm going to be playing a couple 2/2s in the future. I can play those and block with those. But you do have to have a plan to deal with the creature because the combat trick's not going to go away. And similarly, in that vein, if your opponent represents a combat trick early in the game, a lot of the time you should remember that that's in their hand, because then if they get down to 1 or 2 cards and they haven't been playing much, you might think, oh, a lot of the time you'll think, oh, they just have lands in hand, but they represented a combat trick earlier, so they probably still have that combat trick if they represented it and you believed their representation. Another way you can play around combat tricks is simply by blocking in a way that your opponent might not expect. So if your opponent has a 3/3, we're just going to keep it simple. They attack with their 3/3, and you have 2 2/2s and a 3/3. So if your opponent, if you block with the 2 2/2s, which is like the expected block, if you were both tapped out, that would be a better block. You're trading your 2/2 for their 3/3. We're assuming everything's vanilla in this case, and they attack like that. You block with 2 2/2s, and their combat trick might be something like give target creature +2/+2 or +3/+3. Let's just say it's +3/+3 this time. The combat trick that they're representing is +3/+3, and so their creature would become a 6/6, and it would kill both your 2/2s, and they'd still be left with their 3/3. One thing you could do is you could just triple block it. You can say, okay, I accept the fact that if they don't have the combat trick, I trade 3/3s. But if they do have this combat trick, I end up killing their creature. I trade my 3/3 and my 2/2 for their 3/3 and their combat trick. So it ends up as a 2 for 2 instead of a 2 for 1 in that case. So one of the ways is just by blocking in a way your opponent might not expect, throwing a bunch of creatures onto it, even if it ends up as a slightly less favorable exchange. This is also a thing you can do if you're pretty far ahead. So you have, like, maybe you have an expendable 2/2 that you can just throw on, and you know that it will die if they don't have the combat trick, but if they do have the combat trick, then you end up trading instead of losing all your creatures for nothing. So that's one thing you can do. It's really important to know which combat tricks they could have, because some combat tricks that doesn't really work for. So if instead of +3/+3, they had Sure Strike, which is 1 and a red, give a creature +3/+0 and first strike, throwing the extra creature in front of it just ends up you losing a 3/3 and a 2/2 instead of just a couple 2/2s. So you do need to know which combat tricks they could have. But a lot of the time you can play around certain combat tricks just by blocking in unconventional ways. So that is one of the better ways to get a little bit more value from blocking. And then the third way to play around combat tricks is by waiting to have mana of your own up on your turn, because a lot of the time they won't want to run their combat trick into your open mana. So for example, if I have a bounce spell in my hand and it's a cheap one, like say it's just a unsummoned, so it costs 1 mana. I only have to hold up 1 blue mana. If I hold up that 1 blue mana, I can then do pretty much any block I want on their creature, because if they go for a combat trick, I can just bounce their creature in response, trade 1 for 1 with their combat trick, put them behind on tempo, and I gain a huge advantage. Or if I have an instant speed removal spell that I'm planning on using, I can hold that up, and then if they do go for something mid-combat, I can use that if I would like. So waiting a turn to go for the blocks when you have open mana makes it much more risky to go for a combat trick. And that's why combat tricks are much more effective when you're on the offensive, because if you are the aggressor in the situation, then your opponent is forced to play their creatures to block your creatures. So if I'm curving out, I go 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and my opponent has to also go play some creatures. So that on turn 4, they're tapping out for their 4-drop. Then I can attack them with all my creatures, really leverage my combat trick, because they kind of have to block because they're getting overrun on the board, and they're tapped out, so they can't blow me out with a bounce spell or an instant speed removal spell or a combat trick of their own. So combat tricks are at their best in assertive decks and at their worst in control decks, because control decks are often going to be behind. So if your opponent is curving out on you and you have a combat trick, you oftentimes can't play your creature and hold up mana to use the combat trick in the same turn. So they're best when you're attacking and they're worse when you're behind, because they're a great way to punch through extra damage. One final thing I would like to say about combat tricks is there's just a very cool, like, it's like a level up moment when you're using combat tricks, is that you don't want to just use them right away. So going back to the 3/3 into 3/3 example, if I attack my 3/3 into their 3/3 and they block, and I have a combat trick, but they have open mana, this is where it gets kind of tricky, because I'm like, I don't want to get blown out. A lot of the time, what you can do is you can pass priority and just accept the trade, because as long as you're not getting blown out like super badly, like if you don't want to do this if you're attacking your 3/3 into their 3/4, obviously, because you'll just lose your guy. But if you're going to make a fairly decent trade, like you're attacking your 5/5 in and they block with their 3/3 and their 2/2, you can be like, okay, I'll just let this happen, because if they have a better combat trick or a bounce spell or something, you don't get blown out then. So one of the ways you can lose a game is by you going for your combat trick and them having a better one. So for example, if I played Sure Strike, as we were talking about earlier, so I have my 3/3, I attack, I play Sure Strike, it gives my creature +3/+0 in first strike. So now I have a 6/3 first striker. And then they play Titanic Growth, which gives their creature +4/+4 for 2 mana. They now have a 7/7, and they eat my creature and the 3 and the sure strike, and I end up losing out on the trade. So if I just wait, if I pass priority and my opponent wants to risk going for the Titanic Growth, I then have that information for my sure strike, and I was willing to accept the trade as it was. So that's one of the things that a lot of better players will do, is they'll just say, okay, I'll accept this trade as it is. A lot of the time, you almost always want to do this if it's a favorable trade for you. So they'll attack their 3/3 and you'll block with your 2/2/2s. Even if they know you, if they know you have a combat trick because you revealed it for something, you got it back, then a lot of the time you just go like, or even in other cases, but even if they know you have a combat trick that they think you'll use here, oftentimes you just want to say, okay, I'll trade my 3/3 for your 2/2, and that way they don't get to 2-for-1 you or blow you out or do something. So when you have the option to make a favorable trade or an even trade and your opponent has mana up, a lot of the time you just want to take that option. But anyway, that is going to do it for this brief video on how to better play around combat tricks. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions about combat tricks, be sure to let me know in the comment section down below, and I will happily respond with my thoughts or answers. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to click that thumbs up and subscribe to get updates for whenever I post new content. But yeah, that's going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.